Hi, I'm Brian Whipker, Extension Floriculturalist at NC State University. In this podcast, we're going to look at plant growth regulator tips, more specifically at pre-plant liner dips. So let's get started. I'd like to first of all thank Vine Americas for supporting this project and making this podcast possible. So when we're looking at pre-plant liner soaks, the idea is to either control excessive growth of a single individual or a individual plug that might go in a combination pot, especially the more vigorous ones that you can control them earlier on with a liner soak, so when you pot them up, they don't become too overgrown and outcompete the other plants in the pot. So very simplistically, when we did our research, we would just get a container, soak the root system, so we come up about halfway up the root system in with a soak solution, and that's as simple as it is. You might have a bigger container and then put the whole tray in, leave it for the set amount of time, then let it come out and soak, and that will take care of giving a quick PGR application to some of these liners. So when we're looking at pre-plant bulb soaks or pre-plant liner soaks, what we're looking at is really like a drench application. It's a substrate application, then it moves up in the xylem with the plant, that's the green arrows, and throughout the plant and controls the growth. And then a lot of times these chemicals don't move throughout the plant because they're not phloem transported. So the key steps for doing this is that you need to know whether or not you need to do it to a wet plug or a dry plug. A slightly dry plug is best, and we're talking about a plug that needs to be irrigated. So depending on your weather conditions, you don't water them the day before if they're expected then to dry down to the point of where you need to make an application of water. That's the stage that you want to have those plugs at when you do this pre-plant bulb soak. So the difference that happens is that with a dry plug, you get more uptake then, and that's the bar on the left, versus a wet plug, because it's not going to absorb much of that moisture. And so there's a 5x difference in the amount of solution that's taken up. So therefore, there's at least a 5x change, in what would be the optimal rate if you used it dry versus wet. But we pretty well have set up industry standards to be using the dry plug concept and to get a little more consistency going on. Here's some work that Alan Hammer did when he was at Purdue, looking at Easy Way blue petunias 3 weeks after application. So there's a difference here of a wilted plug versus one that was watered just before soaking. And we don't want to go down to wilting necessarily, but you can see the untreated control on the left versus some control occurring on the one in the middle, and almost none. And in some cases, you get a stimulation of growth when you have a very low dose being applied to a plant. And you can see that the plant on the right is quite a bit bigger. So when you're looking at the soak length, most of the water uptake on those dry plugs happen about in 2 minutes. A lot of it happens 97% in the first minute, but at 2 minutes, you get most of it. You could wait till 5 and you get just a little more going on there. Here's some work by Joyce Latimer at Virginia Tech on Rudbeckia, looking at a low dose 0.5 part per million Sioux Magic application, and you can see where she varied from half a minute up to 12 minutes at the time, and she had pretty consistent results going across on those liner soaks. But she had no real variation. So if you're wanting to be a little more safer, we're looking at like really about 2 minutes, 1 minute, then you have the consistency going on with those particular plants. So like I said earlier, you want that solution coming up about halfway up the side of that plug, and so you have good flow in going into those plugs, because most of the roots are at the bottom of that plug. So the timing of treatment has some flexibility. Some work that was done. It can be done 2 hours to 10 days in advance. But in reality, maybe for REI purposes, you might want to do it the day before, and then that takes care of the REI issue, because most of these are less than 24 hours. So it works very well as a treatment the day before. Then people can end up transplanting them in the pots. Here's also some work that Alan Hammer did of looking at how soon do you water the plants in after you make the application. Again, untreated control on the left, a plug that was transplanted 10 minutes after soaking and watered in, and then one that waited 2 hours. So you can tell that it's important to have some uptake, because if you pot them up immediately and water them in, what are you doing? Well, you're flushing out that PGR out of that root ball of that plug, and so you don't get your control. You took it out of the zone of where it has contact with that root system. So it is important to at least wait 2 hours, 1 hour maybe, but just the best option would be treat the day before, let them hold, then transplant the next day, and then you don't have an issue with REI. Also, there are effects, different effects. If the root system's not well developed, you basically are going to nail the plants that have no roots. And so poorly rooted plants should not have a liner dip application done to them. You need to have a good root system to have the uptake. Otherwise, you might get very stunted growth on those plants. So again, for the dry liners, you need to irrigate the plugs 24 hours prior to treatment to help even out the moisture, and then allow the plugs to dry down for the day, and then soak them for 1 to 2 minutes in that solution. Let the excess solution drain out the bottom of the pot, and then you can reuse that. But because there's plenty of uptake occurring, you don't have to worry about dilution or of that chemical, because you're going to have to replenish the solution over time, and that will keep the parts per million where you need it to be. So you also then need to vary your rates based on the plant vigor and the cultivar, and really you're going to have to do some playing around to see what works best for you to determine those optimal rates for your location. Here are some starting point protocols for vigorous plants. These are ones that are actively growing. For Paclo, looking at 0.5 to 4 part per million. For the south, 2 to 8 and maybe up to 12. Uniconazole, 0.05 to 0.5 part per million for the north, 0.1 to 1 for the south, and then top floor has similar rates. The root activity of top floor is equivalent to a uniconazole. So starting rates, I think at this point though, most of the label recommendations that are out there are only on Piccolo, the regular Piccolo product. Here's some work that we did with Piccolo 10XC. You can see with this Argyranthemum that we have some growth control, but really we were looking at needing to go up to the much higher rate, up to about 16 parts per million to start seeing some growth control happening. Also on Coleus Wall Street, you can see some growth control starting to happen around 8 parts per million, and then continuing up, 8 to 12 would give a nice amount of growth control. Fuchsia, very responsive, probably looking at closer down to 4 part per million. You might even want to go a little lower at more northern locations, but it didn't keep the flower power from happening on these plants, but really at 12 and 16 part per million were overdose conditions. Here, just a close-up looking at the change in the vegetative growth versus the flower power that's going to come out. So the 4 parts per million did a nice job of that. And here's just a little more of a close-up shot of the same thing going on. And like I said, the higher rates were excessive. Here's 12 parts per million, but plants were covered with flowers, but it nailed them pretty hard, and that's not recommended to do it. Ipomoea, one of the smaller cultivars, Nero, it didn't really need much growth control, but we're looking probably around 8 parts per million if you were wanting to have some type of growth control to keep those plants smaller. Scaevola is very responsive to PGRs, probably in the 2 to 4 range would be a much better rate. 16 is too high, and you can see here even on 4. Now, given 2 more weeks, the plants looked more fuller with more flowers, but you did change around the amount of growth that occurred even at 4 parts per million, but probably a little lower would be a little better. Here's some work by Joyce Latimer looking at Russian sage, and you can see around 4 part per million started to have growth control, and then 6 worked very well for that. So in summary, again, would like to thank Vine Americas for supporting these podcasts and making these possible. So when you look at pre-plant liner soaks, it works really nice for vigorous plants, and to do that pre-plant liner soak, it really controls that excessive growth. It's very cost-effective option, and you can treat a lot of plants very quickly. And so, treating them, holding them for 24 hours, and then potting them up probably is your best option. But you're going to have to do some trials to determine what rates work best for you at your location, for your species and cultivars that you're using. So with that, thank you again for watching.